great to have you here, Melanie Joy, with us. We have known each other for quite some time now, 10 years plus, I think.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's great to see you again. But Torbjörn and you are new to each other. And yeah, we before we started recording, we talked about our project together, writing a book. And of course, we want the psychology aspect of this as well. That's a very important thing when you talk about why we eat meat, how we can change, and similar questions. So, if I might begin with asking you if you can say something about yourself and your quest to understand our relationship, for us as humans, to animals, and also to meat eating. Could you begin
Yeah,
there?
sure. Thank you. And it's really good to see you again. And it's been really nice to meet Toby as well. So, and thanks for having me on. And I'm really heartened at the fact that this conversation is happening. As you guys have said, we need to have more conversations like this. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my personal story and how I came to do the work that I do, specializing in the psychology of eating animals, and writing my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. My journey started when I was very young. Like many people, I had a dog who I loved, like a family member. And like most people in the world today, I also ate animals. So I cared about animals and I also ate animals. And over the course of so many years and so many meals, I just didn't think about how strange it was that I could pet my dog with one hand while I ate a piece of bacon with the other, a piece of bacon that had once been an animal who was at least as intelligent and sentient and conscious as my dog. I just didn't connect the dots. I didn't make the connection between the meat on my plate and the living being it once was. And like many people, I did care about animals, and I would never want to contribute to their suffering, especially when that suffering was so intensive and really completely unnecessary. But everything changed for me in 1989. I was 23 years old. It's a long time ago now. When I got extremely ill after eating a hamburger that turned out to have been contaminated by a dangerous bacteria, and I ended up in the hospital on intravenous antibiotics. And after that experience, I became a vegetarian sort of by accident. It wasn't any conscious ethical decision that I made. I was just, when you eat something that makes you really, really sick, you're just disgusted by it after that, right? So I was like just disgusted by meat. And so I became a vegetarian by accident, and I had to learn about how to be a vegetarian, essentially. And this was in the 80s, right? So there wasn't the internet at the time. And so as I was learning how to cook for myself and shop for myself, I, of course, encountered information about animal agriculture. And what I learned just shocked and horrified me. I could not believe the extent of harm to the animals, of course. In just one day, more farmed animals are slaughtered globally than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. And the suffering is extraordinary. Um, Harm to the environment, harm to my own body in many ways, public health. So I was just really shocked about what I was learning. But what shocked me in some ways, even more than this information, was that everybody I talked to, like nobody I talked to, was willing to hear what I had to say. They would all say pretty much the same thing. It was like, don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal. Or they'd call me a radical hippie vegan propagandist. I became vegan, after I learned about the dairy industry. And so I became very curious because these were kind people. These were my friends, they were my family members. These were people that shared the same values that I shared. They would never intentionally want to cause harm to animals and the environment and public health. These were rational people. These were people that I had been, just a few months before I got sick. And so I became really curious and I thought, what is going on here where rational, caring people just shut down when it comes to this conversation about eating animals? It wasn't that I was thinking we can't have a difference of opinion. Of course, we'll have a difference of opinion. We're all different people and people have differences. That's not a problem. What was shocking to me was the wall that went up and how people who knew much less about eating animals, about animals' experience, about animal agriculture, much less about that, suddenly acted like they were experts on the issue. And all they wanted to do was to shut down the conversation. And I was the other. Somehow I was no longer a human being with opinions that might mean something, experience that might be valuable. I was just the other. I had become, in their mind, fundamentally different than they are. And there was this resistance. And so this ultimately led me to study psychology. I did a PhD in psychology, and my focus broadly was on the psychology of violence and nonviolence, or we can call this the psychology of oppression and social change, and narrowly on the psychology of eating animals. That's what I wrote my doctoral thesis on. I really wanted to understand how rational, caring people could just stop thinking and stop feeling when it came to this issue of eating animals. And I figured if I could understand what was going on psychologically, then I could understand maybe how to change it, how to have conversations that open minds and hearts rather than conversations that reinforce defensiveness and othering and fighting and attacking.
Right. Thank you. That's a good, great introduction. We had a conversation with the philosopher Peter Singer not long ago. It's online now. And one of the things Torbjörn asked him, so you wrote this book, Animal Liberation, 50 years ago. What surprised you since then? And his answer was that, oh, I thought many more would go vegan after they know the facts, like you have said. You discover the facts, but why doesn't that happen to everyone? I know it's a big question, but what are some of the reasons why people have such a hard time letting go of the meat, letting go of animal products?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for it, and you're absolutely right. The facts don't sell the ideology, essentially. Facts alone are not enough. And this is in large part because of the psychology that we have all inherited that causes us to resist the facts. It causes us to feel defensive against anyone or anything that challenges our deeply ingrained belief that eating animals is legitimate, it's the right thing to do, and not eating animals is the wrong thing to do. Basically, we've inherited this whole psychology. It's like an invisible operating system that keeps us believing these myths that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary, and not eating animals is abnormal, unnatural, and unnecessary. And what this causes us to do is to make choices that are not in alignment with some of our deeper values, like caring, for example, or compassion, and to act against our own interests and the interests of others. All of us are harmed by this broad system. What my research uncovered is that there is an invisible belief system and that conditions us to eat certain animals. So the best way to really understand this is to do a thought experiment, right? So just imagine that you're sitting down and you're biting into a juicy hamburger, and your dining companion turns to you and says, actually, that hamburger is not made of beef. It's made from golden retrievers. Now, chances are what you had just thought of as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you had just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. So therefore, rather than continuing to eat the hamburger, you probably want to throw it in the trash and maybe even go to the streets to protest, right? Your reaction to eating the golden retriever burger is your authentic reaction. Carnism distorts our perceptions and disconnects us from our authentic emotions, like empathy, when it comes to those animals we've learned to classify as edible. And we see this all around the world. In meat-eating cultures all around the world, people learn to classify a handful of animals as edible, and all the rest are inedible. And members of all cultures tend to believe that their own choices are rational. And the choices of other cultures are irrational, disgusting, and often even morally offensive. So carnism conditions us to have these distorted perceptions. Carnism it's a what's called a dominant system. That means it's so widespread that its teachings are basically invisible. They're woven through the very structure of society. They shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, and so on. So, for example, when we study nutrition, we study carnistic nutrition. When we study medicine, we study carnistic medicine. We study carnistic veterinary medicine, carnistic agriculture. This belief that eating animals is the only way to be, the right way to be, normal, natural, and necessary is so deeply ingrained in us that anything that challenges that is seen as irrational, as an offense. When we challenge carnistic bias, we're seen as biased, for example. And so carnism is also not just a dominant system, but it's also a violent system. Now, meat cannot be procured without killing. And, egg and dairy production tend to cause extensive harm and suffering to animals. And most people don't support this. I know you guys were talking about this earlier. Like most people feel very uncomfortable with, and their values don't support unnecessary harm to animals. And yet most people do support the practice because they've been so conditioned to support it, just to disconnect, to not think about it, to believe in these myths, right? Carnism uses these psychological defense mechanisms. These are these ways of thinking that distort our perceptions and disconnect us from our authentic feelings so that we support a practice that we would normally not support. And because carnism is so dominant, when we're born into carnism, we learn to look at the world through the lens of carnism. We we internalize this carnistic defensiveness, which is why we hear this, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal.
I haven't thought much about this, so I guess I'm a natural carnicist. We are all, three of us, born up with meat, and this is kind of natural for me. It's a very cultural thing. Most people, whatever the cause is, they really want to eat meat, and they do it. So it's interesting to hear that there could be like a psychological. That's not reasoning. That's the feeling, not the facts that are creating
Melanie,
this.
you're talking about the psychological reasons why we don't want to change, but like I read the book Meat by Bruce Friedrich, maybe you've heard of it, where he argues, we need to come up with better products that are more similar to meat, because, and I think his reason is mainly that people crave meat for the taste and for like the feeling it gives us and so on. So could that be also like almost biological reasons why we eat meat?
Well, it's a really good question. Could there be biological reasons where we eat meat? And I can talk about that in a minute. So, these are great questions actually that you raise. Since I wrote my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, there's a whole field that focuses on the psychology of eating animals. And there's been a lot of research. So most of us grow up eating meat, right? Most of us grow up never learning to question this, never even looking at eating meat as a choice. It's just a given. Right? It's just the way things are. We assume it's the way things are, the way things always have been, and the way things always will be, right? So we don't even realize that we're making a choice when we eat meat because we don't realize really that we have a choice. And so what my research showed, and then I'll talk about what other research has shown that speaks to your specific questions, is that, most people, we do eat meat. We do feel attracted to the idea of eating meat. I mean, I can say this, when I was growing up, I was the meat lover's pizza girl. For Domino's Pizza, I used to get every kind of meat on there, and sometimes double pepperoni, right? So I completely relate. I loved my Italian nana's, meat lasagna, and I grew up with all sorts of meat dishes. My Jewish stepmother's matzo ball soup, chicken soup. So I completely relate. And research has shown that most people, the vast majority of people, do feel an internal discomfort with the idea of causing harm, unnecessary harm to others, other humans, and certainly other animals. You know, people, you guys know this, right? People cringe. They don't want to think of animals suffering, right? And this is called cognitive moral dissonance or cognitive dissonance. It's the discomfort we feel when our values, which is practicing kindness to animals, treating them the way we would want to be treated if we were in their situation, are not in alignment with our behaviors. And when our values and behaviors are not aligned, we have three choices, right? We can change our behaviors to match our value, or well, let's say we could change our values and say, like, I'm not a compassionate person. Research has shown that most people don't do this. We need to believe that we really feel like we're living a moral life. We can change our behaviors to match our values. When it comes to not eating animals, it's hard for people often. Like they can feel a real struggle with this. There's a lot of pressure to conform to the norm. We're really quite indoctrinated. And there are other reasons as well. Or the third option is we can change our perception of our behaviors. And it's around this third option that carnism is organized. We go through, and we have lots of research on this now. People go through so many mental gymnastics in order to eat animals and to maintain this feeling of comfort around eating animals. So, some of these carnistic defenses are, let me just describe them, and I think they'll speak specifically to your questions, right, that I found. We learn to see farmed animals, for example, or think of farmed animals as abstractions rather than individuals. This is a defense, de-individualization. People don't need to worry about that word, right? So, for example, even though we recognize that our dogs have personalities, right, and they're individuals with lives that matter to them, like our lives matter to us, we learn to think that a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. Carnism also conditions us to see or think of farmed animals as objects, right? So when we refer, at least in English, when in many languages, when we refer to the chicken on our plate as something rather than someone, right? So these are distancing mechanisms. We also learn to justify eating animals. Justification is one of the defenses, the carnistic defenses. By learning to believe that the myths of eating animals are the facts of eating animals. And there's a vast mythology surrounding eating animals, but all of these myths fall under what I refer to as the three ends of justification. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. These are a widely held set of opinions presented as facts, taught to us in universities, in schools, through our religions, through our medicine, through all social institutions, basically. And these are the same arguments that have been used to justify problematic practices throughout human history. Male dominance, heterosexual supremacy, they've all been portrayed as normal, natural, and necessary for the well-being or survival of the dominant group, right? The gender, the species, the nation, so on and so forth. Researchers have added to this since my book came out. They've studied this, and they've added to this a fourth N. Eating animals is nice. And this is what you two are talking about, or you, Toby, were talking about, right? People eat animals because it tastes good, because we were conditioned to eat animals from a very early age. So to answer, your question about this, we like eating animals, and yet we have vegan meats, for example. So what does that say about us psychologically? Isn't that weird? Vegan people say we shouldn't eat animals, and yet they're eating vegan hamburgers. The thing is that we're so conditioned to associate hamburgers, lasagna, all these pizza, pepperoni with something that tastes good, that feels good, that's palatable. That doesn't change. Like, I didn't stop eating animals because I stopped liking the way they taste. I stopped eating animals ultimately because I stopped wanting to contribute to harm toward them. So that's one explanation. And when it comes to the biological element, I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to speak to this, but I do know quite a bit about nutrition. What I can say is that we tend to assume that because we have always eaten animals, this means that our bodies are biologically designed to eat animals. And I would suggest that we look at this more critically. We can't have a objective conversation about eating animals while we're operating from within the system, carnism, that conditions us to believe that eating animals is the right thing to do, the only thing to do. Just like we can't have an objective conversation about sexual harassment without understanding patriarchy, right? You're in this mindset that causes you to see it with such a bias. So, for example, when we look at history, right, to look at what's biologically natural for us, healthy for us, we're really looking at history. We're looking at carnistic history. We're looking at history through the lens of carnism. We only look as far back in history as we need to justify current carnistic practices. So our very earliest ancestors ate fruit with an occasional insect stuck in the apple or whatever. Later, they became scavengers. And then they became gatherer hunters. And then they became agriculturalists, right? We only look as far back as we need to justify carnism. So we have to step out of carnism to really have this conversation rationally or objectively. And frankly, there are behaviors that we've been engaging in for as long as eating animals, like rape and murder, and we don't say, well, we've always been doing this, so it must be the right thing to do. So I don't know if that totally addresses your questions, but I think my point is not to answer all of these questions, but rather to suggest that only with an understanding of the psychology that deeply conditions us to have this assumption, this core assumption that we have to eat animals. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. Only then can we have the kind of objective conversation we need to have.
One line of justification, at least for me, is that it's okay to eat meat if because of the values involved. Yes, the animals, they suffer to some degree. There is violence in killing them, at least. But on the other hand, I really like to eat meat, and it gives me happiness, and my happiness stands against the animal's suffering. Yeah, because I'm worth it. I'm worth it. So they have to take a beat because I want to be happy, and if I take care of the animals enough, it could be justified.
Yeah,
I know it's not necessary. I know we don't need it. I know I can survive, and I can probably lead a pretty good life without meat. But there is a dimension of pure happiness here. But I have to give up to the animals, and I don't want to do that.
Well, I really appreciate your openness about this and your honesty about it, and non-defensiveness around it. And I think that is very well true, probably for many people who don't admit this to others or even to themselves. And to this, I would suggest that this helps, I think, really lay out a path forward that makes sense. Let me back up and share a brief story with you that I think will illustrate this point better than I can just say it. I was on a long flight once I live in Germany, and back from South Africa, a long flight, and I was sitting next to a young man who was a Lufthansa pilot coming home from holiday. And he was asking what I had been doing in South Africa. And I told him I'd been talking about my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. And he said, oh, so maybe are you vegan? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, I used to be vegan. I said, oh. And he said, I'm not anymore. And I said, well, why not? Thinking it must be for some health concerns, or I don't know. Usually that's the reason. He said, well, I said, why did you become vegan? And I thought it was going to be for his health. And he said, oh, I read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation and, the things that we're talking about here. He said, and then he just started going on about how he said, once you read that book, you can't really justify eating animals anymore. And, he said, I live in Berlin. It's so easy to be vegan. And, he went on and on about all the reasons. And I said, well, why did you stop being vegan? Because you seem like you believe in it. And he said, well, of course I believe in it. I'm a rational person. I have empathy. Anybody who's really rational has empathy is probably going to support the idea that we shouldn't unnecessarily harm animals. And I know it's not necessary. And I said, well, then what happened? And he said, well, I'm a pilot. And there were just so many times where I got on the plane, they called me last minute, and I couldn't order food beforehand. I didn't have enough at home to prepare. It was just too hard for me. It was just not sustainable for me. And there were just too many times where I would land somewhere in the middle of the night and I'd have to get salad with dressing that had dairy in it or whatever, right? So it kind of came down to what you're saying, Toby, which is like, for him, it just didn't feel he believed in it, like you're saying, it's not necessary. He understood it. And yet he said, my well-being, it's just not possible for me to have a life that I feel like I can live while being fully vegan. And so then I asked him a question, and I said, well, what about being as vegan as possible? And he said, oh, can I do that? And I said, yes, I give you permission. He literally said that to me. I said, yes, I give you permission. And then he said, oh, well, I can totally do that. I think I could be 95% vegan. And frankly, what we're talking about here, the activist Henry Spiro once said, if you go into a negotiation asking for all or nothing, you're probably going to wind up with nothing, right? We don't want to frame this conversation as either you're vegan and you're part of the problem, or you're part of the solution, or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. That doesn't get anywhere. We don't need everybody to turn vegan to create a world that is a world that's much, much better for animals. We just need enough people to be vegan enough. And I always recommend that, sure, for many people, it comes down to, it doesn't feel sustainable for me to be 100% vegan, but that doesn't mean that I can't say I will sit down to each meal and say, how vegan can I make this and still feel like my life is a life that I can live comfortably? And in so doing, we are helping to transform or end carnism. This system is deeply problematic. And we are increasing demand for products that can, eventually replace the animal products. We will probably transition away from animal agriculture in a way over years that doesn't harm farmers, and actually that's good for farmers, that's good for people, and of course that's good for animals. And we're going to slow down that transformation if we don't give people permission to transform personally in a way that works for them.
I think that's a great suggestion, but I think also that we, as you say, and I consider myself also being a carnist because I have this history. I don't get rid of it completely. I've tried, and I think I've succeeded somewhat. But also I think what might be a problem still at you, Torbjörn, that as we all are carnists, you value your life in humans much more than animals, and that's why you think my happiness might be higher on a certain scale, the values of animals. Could that be maybe a reason for you thinking it's okay as long as you are happy?
Are you asking me? I think everybody. I haven't met anyone during this project that at heart doesn't believe that a life of a human being is more valuable than the life of an animal. No one, not even the vegan activists that I have talked to, say that. Of course, I value animals and one animal exactly as much as one man or one woman.
But it doesn't have to be exactly either. I mean, for you to value your pleasure by eating meat, maybe for 15 minutes, it has to be much, much higher than the value of a life, because I mean, generally we put the value of a life and also the suffering
I see
much higher than the pleasure of eating, right? So you have to lower the value of the animal really a lot less, right? Than life.
Well, you can always fix the accountings in your favor if you want to, of course. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to value the suffering much more than the life. I mean, if an animal is dead, it cannot suffer anymore. But the actual suffering when it suffers is way much intense than the happiness that I can feel from eating a burger. Of course. So of course you have to be fair in that calculations, but I still hope and think it's kind of possible.
I think you're both bringing up a couple of really important points. First of all, I just want to say I don't use the term carnist. I used that originally when I first wrote the first edition of the book. I don't think it is a really helpful term to use. I use carnistic as an adjective because I don't want to reduce people to an identity, particularly a negative identity that they didn't choose and, was given. All of us were kind of given this, mindset when we were born and growing up. I do think, Toby, what you're saying it's very true. Everybody when you're born into a dominant system, you're going to carry some remnant, some amount of the assumptions of that system, no matter how hard you try to get out of it. So, for example, I'm a white person and I've been born into a racist world. And I know that it's very clear. I know that I've studied this. I've taught courses on this subject. I know a lot about internalized racism. I know enough to know that no matter how much I study, no matter how much I learn, there's probably always going to be some way unconsciously that I am thinking in a racist manner because I've been so indoctrinated and the world continues to indoctrinate me, and because I'm a white person. So I don't think it's realistic for us to think that anybody gets fully outside. I mean, maybe some enlightened people will get fully outside of the carnistic mindset. In English, we have an expression, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Right? And so maybe you have that in Swedish as well. But to really approach this conversation with an understanding of the fact that people will come to this, Peter Singer talks about speciesism. We're not going to drop our speciesism right away, probably not ever in this lifetime. It's just not going to happen. We live in two speciesist a world, but we don't have to, right? We can find paths forward so that we can increase over time. I mean, hopefully, increase our own awareness and understanding of the problem and reduce our support of the problem. And in that process, become increasingly a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. If we think of carnism and veganism psychologically and also practically on a spectrum, right? Sometimes what's most important is not where you are, but what direction you're heading in. How committed are you to growing your awareness? How committed are you to reducing the harm, that you're participating in? And that's the only, when we're talking about trying to bring about widespread change for animals, if we don't approach the conversation in a way that feels safe and relatable and doable to people, many people will just turn it off and not do anything about it, which is why I think asking people to be as vegan as possible, asking people to be vegan allies, which is an ally, somebody who's not vegan, but who's, I think Toby would probably be a good example of this, somebody who's helping in the transformation of carnism, even though they're not vegan themselves. So there are different paths forward. And in terms of harm and suffering, I think it is definitely an important distinction to make. You were talking about, Toby, like eating a hamburger, and you're like, well, I know there's harm in this. Somebody died, but it's not the same suffering as, a hamburger that was procured from an animal who had been in a factory farm, for example. And there's truth in that, and that's important to acknowledge. And at the same time, I think it's also important for people to, I believe that it's probably more useful for change to reduce consumption rather than only change the type of consumption of animal products. So, for example, I call this compassionate carnism. Right. So, for example, most of us would consider it cruel to slaughter a happy, healthy golden retriever just because we like the way her legs taste. And yet when we do the exact same thing to individuals of other species, we learn to think that this is compassionate. In some ways, it's less compassionate because they want to keep living. They don't want to lose their lives. And because then there are other animals that grieve them. Right. I'm not saying that I have the solution. I'm saying that I think we have to acknowledge that there's carnistic psychology plays a role in all forms of meat production, not just the most horrific. And I also want to bring in a piece about farmers because I think it's important. I think one of the ways that we get stuck in these conversations about ending this global atrocity, which we all are in agreement about, is an atrocity. This is a problem. When we're talking about trillions and trillions of individual animals who are, treated brutally and unnecessarily slaughtered, nobody wants this kind of a system. The question is, how do we work toward a better system, right? A different system. And it's really easy to see farmers, agriculturalists as the opponents of people who are advocating to end carnism. And I think it's important for us to recognize that we are all participants in this system. We are all harmed by this system in different ways. We've been interviewing farmers, for example, for our feature documentary. There's been a lot of work done on the experience of farmers and the impact of farming animals on many farmers who struggle with what is called moral injury in psychology. This is a form of trauma, basically. It's not necessarily trauma with a capital T, but sometimes it is, where they are deeply torn and feel deeply conflicted about what they're doing with animals. And we've talked to, there are a number of farmers who are trying to actually change the way that they do agriculture, but they can't. They want to transition away from animal agriculture to plant-based agriculture, but they can't. They're just trapped in the system, and they're at the mercy of these big corporate conglomerates that are forcing them to make choices that are not their own.
I'm going to meet a couple of those farmers in 2 weeks' time in the UK, actually. So I'm going to a field study there to meet some vegan farming, stock-free farming, and so on.
Oh,
so that will
great.
be interesting. But they are very few, and they are struggling for sure. So it's not mainstream. And since I know quite a few farmers, I would say basically you don't have to grow stock to be a farmer. Most farmers they grow plants, and then they feed it to the animals. But I would say that the animals they are more of a problem. It's really hard to the husbandry is very hard to do. They are not cooperating that much. Animals they don't like it, so they are resisting the system. So I guess most farmers would be better off if they stopped farming animals and just stick to plants, and then they could get a couple of dogs or perhaps a small herd of free range hens or something to fulfill the emotional need to have some company out of the farm, basically. But so I don't think it should be that much a problem to stop farming with animals. Farmers are used to produce what people would like to eat. So if we all would like to eat plant-based food, they would produce that happily.
I think that that's really great to hear. And farmers that we've talked to and that I know of as well, one of the struggles is that they've been doing this. They've only been farming pigs, for example, and they can't get out of it because this is what their business has been or their business is based on. And so they feel trapped in it. And it might be different in different, I'm sure it's different in different countries. One farmer was saying that, they struggle terribly. They hate, killing the animals is or even sending the animals to be slaughtered in some cases they're very conflicted about it, but they can't talk to their colleagues, like other farmers, because then they look like they're weak, and there's this whole sort of system. So I'm really happy to hear what you've said, and it kind of brings me back to our earlier conversation, like before we got started with the interview, which is, we've learned to see ourselves in some ways as quote unquote enemies, but we really all want the same thing. Like we want a world and a system in which there's as little suffering as possible and in which we can live, and honor our well-being psychologically, and physically, in the best way possible. And so I think, a conversation like this is a really great opportunity to invite people to discuss this openly.
One of the themes in our book will be, is it possible to eat meat ethically somehow? And Torbjörn and I have visited small-scale ecological farm, organic farm, where the pigs could run around outside, and they seem to be much more happy than any factory farm. And quite a big difference, I would say. And their philosophy on how they treated animals. They had their own local slaughterhouse and so on. And I think, and I'm not thinking about Torbjörn now specifically, but people who go there and buy this meat, it's really expensive, so I don't think they would do it a lot. But maybe that will like form an image of them, like I'm really caring about animals because I go to this farm and buy this expensive meat. This is the kind of person I am. But maybe then they won't see or think about the dairy and the eggs and maybe the hamburger they take at McDonald's and so on, because they have this image on how caring they are, only because maybe they buy occasionally at this farm. Is this prevalent, and what do you think about that?
I mean, it's a concern that some vegans have that I have heard about, and they're worried that people give themselves because they eat, quote unquote ecological meat, however you want to put it, bio meat, once in a while, that means all the other meat they eat is not contributing to the problem. I don't know how widespread this is. I think some of this is really just about messaging. I think it's important not to police people's self-perceptions and, make ourselves the experts on people's self-perceptions and their own psychology when it comes to these issues, because I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if people are actually saying, oh, because I buy meat from a bio farm once a month, that gives me a free pass to eat meat every day from McDonald's, right? That's an assumption that's been made. I don't know if that's an accurate assumption. I think that's sort of the least of the problems facing the world and facing animals. As I said, more farmed animals are slaughtered globally in one day than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. First of all, very few people are doing this in the first place, and really keeping our sights on the bigger picture and working to change institutions, to get institutions. And this is where the big change happens, is in institutions. To shift the way they practice is going to make a much, much bigger difference. So for example, getting default vegan foods, getting the default option in airlines to be vegan. And if you don't want vegan, that's fine. You can order the non-vegan, the carnistic meal, but you have to order that, right? Or getting, animal-free lunches served in cafeterias 2 full days a week, or something like that.
There is a need for change on a personal level, on an institutional level, legislative level, perhaps. And I guess all those levels have to interact and support each other. But it seems that people don't like to be told what to eat. Then they turn around and they eat more meat in protest because you just told them not to eat meat. So how can we reach the human mind and get them to eat less meat?
Yeah, I mean, most people don't like to be told what to do. Some people more than others, depending on lots of different factors. When I wrote my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, the goal of this book wasn't to discuss all the reasons people, quote unquote, shouldn't eat meat, but rather to talk about why we do eat meat in the first place. And I think that that's a useful way to approach the situation, to really raise awareness and say, here's what's happening, with the assumption that most people do not and would not support this practice if they were more aware. Here's what's happening. Here is what's happening to you psychologically. These are your psychological, this is the psychology of eating animals. Research has shown that when we make people aware of their unconscious assumptions and biases, that those biases lose some of their power, right? So we make this operating system or psychology, recognized. We raise awareness in that way. And also, very importantly is, providing alternatives and again, inviting people to be what I call a vegan ally. A vegan ally is a supporter of veganism and vegans, even though they're not fully vegan themselves, and to to recognize that like there are lots of ways that you can help contribute to ending this problem, right? So for example, some of the people, like my book, Why We Love Dogs, it's out in 23 languages now, Swedish being one of them. So it's most of my publishers are not vegan, and they've done a tremendous job of pushing the book out there. Many people who interview me are not vegan, not even vegetarian, but they raise awareness, and they might do more to help animals than a single vegan does by not eating them throughout their lifetime. Right? Some people who donate to my organization, Beyond Carnism, and other organizations who are doing this work are not vegan or vegetarian, but they're using their financial influence the way that they can. So really inviting people to be a part of the solution in any way that works for them. Use your influence. Here's what's going on in the world. Here's the problem that's happening. Here's what's happened to you psychologically, what's going on because you were born into the system. And here are some ways that you can get involved and help make a difference. And ideally, you try to be as vegan as possible in the process. And this provides a lot of opportunities for people to participate who I think normally would be put off if all they heard was, here's the problem, you should be vegan, 100% vegan.
If you are more aware of a problem, then you can deal with it and maybe at least go in some direction to stop behaving bad.
Yeah, if you're aware of the problem, and it helps to be aware of the psychology as well, because as you talked about with Peter Singer, people learn about the problem and they're aware of it, but their operating system, this carnistic mentality, this speciesist mentality is just pulling them right back into this cocoon of unknowing. Carnism pulls us back into this numb feeling, this disconnection, these cognitive distortions. So becoming aware of the psychology, and becoming connected. I forgot to mention this, becoming connected somehow with a community that is also aware, that can help keep you awake. This is about wakefulness. We all fall back asleep very easily when it comes to many problems, many social issues, many other issues, right? We know, quote unquote, the right thing to do, and yet we forget it and we just fall back asleep. So we have to keep ourselves awake and keep ourselves supported through the change by being connected with community, ideally, or at least one other person who understands and is on the same path.
I can see Martin sometimes. He's protesting outside the slaughterhouses with horrible pictures. Well, not so horrible in this case, but still, he wants people to stop. Now he's kind of scaring people with the horrible facts of slaughtering. And sometimes I think it would be much more useful and helpful for the animals if he just cooked vegan soup and gave away to people for lunches and say, here's a good vegan soup that I have made, and you can do that yourself tomorrow, and you don't have to buy meat, and you can save some money probably. Or is this a positive force or a negative force to people?
Well, it's not a question. I mean, I think Martin probably is a person to answer this, but I can weigh in on this since you asked me first. Activism's like anything. It's like, does parenting work? It depends on what kind of parent you are, right? It depends on how you approach raising your child. And activism depends on how you approach engaging in activism. It's important to make the invisible visible, and activists realize that. It's also important to make the invisible visible in ways that increase the chances that people will hear our message the way we intend it to be heard. It's also important to provide alternatives like, soup, vegan soup, right? It's just a question of what form of activism. There are some forms of activism that definitely don't work. Some principles that we all need to abide by. But many forms of activism do work when they're communicated in a way that is resonant with other people. And it might be that, a time and a place. I don't know, Martin, you can speak to this because it's about your protest.
Yeah, I have studied this a bit, though, of course, I'm biased because I am activist. This is my life, but but my thinking is that, like the example, me standing with a sign at a slaughterhouse, and maybe a message like we actually have on one of the signs, "Why love the dog and eat the cow." and some get angry, but I think also it triggers this disconnect that you talked about, Melanie. And of course, that's uncomfortable to face up to this issue. So maybe that triggers something negative in them. But my thinking is that this need to be triggered, this need to be challenged, and hopefully they go home and talk to the family and say, "Oh, I saw this sign and it got me angry," and so on. But maybe that can trigger some discussion and maybe question some of it, because it's also about effectiveness. Okay, I can cook soup for people, but how many can I reach in that way? I can't go home to every home.
Right, right.
I can reach a bit more people, I imagine, by standing and having maybe hundreds of cars passing by and seeing my message.
Right. And this is, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, if I would say something about what would make me change completely going vegan, because I'm not at the moment, so I know everything and I'm not vegan. Okay. So how could I go all the way? Well, I guess the food that I would eat instead, it has to be as good as nice as, cheaper, available, safe, both physically and psychologically. So there's a lot of demands on the alternative food that I have, and in an essence, it has to be better than meat in every sense, cheaper and higher quality and tastier and so on. Of course, it's impossible to meet
Right
those
now it
demands.
is.
Yeah.
Right now it is. I mean, it's a very high bar for right now. But as I was saying before, we don't need everybody to be vegan in order to create a vegan world. We need enough people to be vegan enough so that there's awareness and there's an allocation of resources so that we can end up having more food that's tastier and that's as healthy as we want it to be, and that's affordable as we want it to be. Right now, the system is set up so that carnistic products are subsidized. Carnistic products are prioritized. Carnistic products are what are being promoted. So once we have enough people vegan enough, then the scales of power, will shift. And sometimes, people need to be uncomfortable to change, as you point out, Martin. It's just a question of like, this is a whole other conversation, right? But how do we do this in a way that, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm just putting out a question, right? One thing I do know the answer to is that, non-shaming and non-guilting communication is essential, because as soon as people feel shamed or guilty, the defenses are going to go up. So we want to raise awareness in a way that helps people to feel, invited into the conversation rather than shamed and blamed and called hypocrites.
Do you have time for one last question?
Sure.
And that is, if you have any suggestions on how we can make the book accessible, like that meat eaters want to pick it up, maybe in our tone and how we message it. Yeah.
Just making a really clear what's in it for me right at the beginning. So I was looking at the title of it, and I think for anybody who's attached to meat, the title communicates that if you read this book, you're probably going to feel like you shouldn't be eating meat again and you can't eat meat again. First of all, to have non-shaming, non-blaming information, and just to make sure that it's speaking to the needs and desires of the readers, right? So the readers, people want to feel good about their lives. There's a quote from Viktor Frankl. You might know the psychiatrist who was in a concentration camp. And he talked about, it's not a direct quote, I have it written down, I wanted to just share it, but he talked about how we all experience this ongoing tension between who we are and who we want to be. Right? Most people have this pain point. Most people, when it comes to eating animals, experience this pain point, who we are and who we want to be. So being able to honor that and understand that and provide people with information that helps them to live more in alignment with who they want to be without making it be like, this is ethical, this is unethical, could be really helpful. People get very triggered around this issue very easily. So making it really clear, this is what you're going to get from this book. Like after reading this book, you're going to be in a better position to be making choices that feel good for you, are sustainable for you, that allow you to be more of the person you want to be. I mean, I don't know, however you want to do it, but just to keep it focused on the value to the reader, which you've probably already thought about, so I'm not telling you anything useful.
No, that was really good advice. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciative.
It's good. It's a pleasure. I'm glad you guys are writing this book. It sounds like a very interesting project, and might even be, useful to frame the whole book as an invitation to stop seeing each other as enemies and to really talk about how we're on the same side. Even if you have a title that communicates that. I think that could be really useful, and have that be an important piece of what you're communicating about, and not necessarily have a book that's providing all the answers, but a book that's providing people with a way to discuss and work toward the answers collaboratively.
That's good. Thank you. We will let you go now, Melanie.
Good luck with it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Take care.